Working at Google has always been more than just a career for me. It's been something much more. I joined the company 5 years ago, and since then it has become my second home. Corporate events, team building, and the constant exchange of ideas have shaped our team. So, when we were invited to the annual party at the Mountain View headquarters, I was thrilled. But this time I decided to bring Julia, my wife. Julia was not only beautiful, she always attracted people to her. Her charisma and ability to communicate could charm anyone. I knew that my colleagues would like her, and I wanted her to see the world I work in. It was important for me to show her why I sometimes come home late or stay on calls until midnight. We arrived at the office in the evening. The headquarters was illuminated with bright neon lights, and we were greeted at the entrance by robotic hosts, classic Google style. Inside, the atmosphere was lively. Music, laughter, and the aroma of delicious food from the food courts. Julia was holding my hand, and I noticed several of my colleagues paying attention to her. She looked stunning, wearing a black dress that emphasized her figure and light makeup that only added to her charm. I started introducing her to the team. My colleagues were delighted with her, especially Alex, our newest developer. He had recently joined the team and had already become popular for his humor and ease of communication. Alex was a few years younger than me, with the confidence that comes from people who haven't suffered any major defeats yet. He was joking with Julia, and she was laughing, maybe a little too loudly. I chalked it up to her sociability. After all, that's what I've always liked about her. We sat down at a table with a few of my colleagues. Julia quickly gained attention by telling funny stories from our life together. She was always in the center of things, and I was proud of her. But at some point, I noticed that she started to engage in a dialogue mostly with Alex. Their laughter was getting louder and louder, and although I tried to stay calm, I felt uncomfortable. Later, Julia said she wanted to drink water and got up from the table. I nodded and went back to talking to my colleagues. But a few minutes later, I noticed that Alex had disappeared as well. It seemed like a coincidence, but something in my chest tightened. I turned my gaze to the terrace, where I knew many guests were gathering for conversations. As I waited for Julia to return, my excitement began to build. Thoughts were running through my head. Am I exaggerating? But I couldn't shake the impression that something was wrong. I decided to wait a little longer before I started looking for her. When Julia came back, she looked a little confused, although she tried to act as if nothing had happened. Her smile was strained, and her eyes avoided my gaze. Alex returned to the table right after her, making the excuse that he was talking to a colleague. I didn't say anything, but I started to boil. This game seemed too obvious. As the party continued, I couldn't focus on talking anymore. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts kept returning to what I was seeing. Julia looked at Alex from time to time, and every glance she gave me felt like a betrayal. But I decided I wasn't going to do anything for now. I wanted to know the truth, but not here and not now. I felt that this party would change everything. Uncertainty and anxiety were plaguing me, even as I tried to keep everything under control. After Julia and Alex returned to the table, the atmosphere already seemed tense. Although the party continued in a cheerful rhythm, it was no longer a celebration for me. Their occasional glances that crossed were too obvious. I tried to ignore it, but I realized that something was happening beyond my comprehension. An hour after they returned, Julia said she wanted to get some fresh air. I offered to go with her, but she assured me that she only needed a short break. She said it as casually as if nothing special had happened. I forced myself to agree, even though the fire of doubt was already burning in my chest. She left the room, and I stayed at the table, watching Alex suddenly get up and walk in the same direction a few minutes later. Now I couldn't sit any longer. My heart was beating faster, and I felt like everything was getting out of control. I stood up and walked out of the room, heading for the terrace. I was no longer interested in my colleagues conversations, or music. I wanted to know the truth. When I got to the terrace, my heart sank at what I saw. Julia and Alex were standing in the corner, as if trying to stay out of sight of the other guests. Their postures were too close. Alex was saying something, and Julia seemed to be listening attentively. Her hand lightly touched his shoulder, and that was the last straw. Everything I had seen before confirmed my worst suspicions. I walked closer, not giving them time to react. Julia was the first to notice me, and her face instantly changed. From surprise, she turned to anxiety, as if she was afraid I would make a scene. Alex turned around later, but there was no guilt on his face. On the contrary, he looked calm, even cocky. This look was a red flag for me. "Where have you been?" I asked coldly, addressing Julia. My voice was low and hard, like a cry. She looked down as if searching for an answer. "We were just talking, Mark. It was nothing. I went to get some fresh air, and Alex happened to come over." Her words were hesitant, and her voice betrayed anxiety. "Just talking," I repeated, but my attention had already shifted to Alex. His calm appearance and slight smile were a challenge. I took a step toward him, feeling the rage take hold of me. "Do you like hitting on other people's wives?" I said, and he just shrugged his shoulders in response. "Relax, Mark. There's nothing here." That was the last straw. I grabbed him by the collar and pushed him against the wall. Julia shouted my name, trying to intervene, but I wasn't listening anymore. My anger was controlling me. Alex tried to break away, but I hit him, silencing him. Several guests on the terrace started screaming, and someone called security. The fight lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. When the guards intervened and pulled us apart, I was breathing heavily and my hands were still shaking. Julia stood aside, pale and scared. Alex mumbled something, wiping blood from his lip, but I didn't care. I was escorted off the terrace, and I already knew that this party had ended for me not only in a scandal, but also in the collapse of a relationship. My anger was justified, but I felt the consequences of that moment with my whole being. Now all that remained was to find out how far Julia had gone in this betrayal. I was taken from the terrace to a separate room for security, leaving me alone. My hands were still trembling, my heart was pounding in my chest, and the images of the last few minutes were playing in my head. The feeling of rage gradually changed to cold anger. Alex and Julia stayed on the terrace, and I didn't even want to think about what happened after I left. After a few minutes, the guard came into the room. He said I needed to calm down and avoid any contact with Alex for the rest of the evening. They gave me the option of staying in the room or going home. I chose the second option. I wanted to get away from that place as soon as possible. While I was driving home, my thoughts were chaotic. What's next? Was it really as obvious as I had imagined? Had Julia betrayed me, or was it just a play of my imagination? But how could I explain that closeness, her disturbing appearance, and her lies? I had no proof, but what I had seen was enough to make my trust in her shake. I got to the apartment. The empty walls seemed even more depressing than usual. Instead of going to bed, I went from room to room, trying to calm down. My phone was on the table, and I couldn't decide whether to text Julia. I wanted to know if she would come home and what she would say. A few hours later, the door opened. Julia entered the apartment, looking tense but trying to look confident. Her dress was a little wrinkled, her makeup smeared, but she looked calm. She walked into the living room and met my eyes. "Mark, you should have controlled yourself," she said, sitting down on the couch. Her voice was cold, almost judgmental. I remained standing without answering. My silence seemed to irritate her more than any words. She continued, "What you did was just disgusting. You have embarrassed me in front of all your colleagues." I took a step closer, feeling the anger rise again. But this time I controlled my emotions. I gathered my strength and calmly answered. Awkward position? Julia, you were standing on the terrace with Alex, touching his shoulder and lying to me about it. What did you expect? That I would keep quiet and pretend that nothing had happened? She lowered her eyes, but didn't answer right away. Her silence spoke more than any words. She knew her behavior was inappropriate, but she didn't want to admit it. A gap formed between us. I couldn't trust her anymore, and she didn't seem to want to explain her actions anymore. She went to the bedroom, saying she didn't have the energy to discuss it now. I stayed in the living room, wondering how we got to this point. I took the next day off, not wanting to see my colleagues or Alex. I needed time to decide how to proceed. Julia did not speak to me. We lived under the same roof, but we had become strangers. I decided to find out the truth. If she didn't want to tell me, I would find other ways to find out what really happened that night. The next few days were difficult. The tension between Julia and me became almost unbearable. We spoke only when necessary, and the glances she gave me were filled with awkwardness. I felt that every new day brought us closer to an inevitable breakup. But instead of acting on impulse, I decided to gather the facts. I needed the truth, even if it was painful. One evening when Julia left the house, I went through her phone. It was a risky move, but I needed to know. Her messages with Alex were superficial, but one conversation caught my attention. She had saved her lover's number under a fake name, but the context spoke for itself. Thanks for the other night. It was nice to be alone. I'm glad you made the decision. Didn't mark suspect anything? The words hit me like a punch in the chest. Her lying, her nervousness, all of it confirmed my suspicions. She hadn't just flirted with Alex on the terrace. She had made the choice to betray me. When she came home, I was already waiting for her. She took one look at me and realized something was wrong. Her face changed when I showed her the screenshots of the correspondence. What is this? I asked, holding the phone in my hands. My voice was as cold as a knife blade. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Her silence was the answer. I couldn't take it anymore. The rage I had been holding back broke through. You made me feel like an idiot, Julia. Did you think I wouldn't notice anything? That I was blind? Her eyes filled with tears, but I could no longer feel sympathy. She started to make excuses, saying that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. But her words rang hollow. I didn't believe a word she said anymore. That evening, I couldn't stay at home. I packed my things and went to my friend's house. I didn't know how long it would last, but I couldn't go back to the way things were. The next morning, I filed for divorce. A few days later, I received an email from Google's HR team. The incident at the corporate party had caused serious discussions in the office. My behavior, although provoked, had jeopardized my reputation. I decided to leave my job to avoid further consequences. It was not only the end of my marriage, but also the end of my career at a company I loved. Julia tried to contact me, wrote long messages, but I never responded. Her choice destroyed everything we had built together. I decided that the only way out was to start a new life without her. A few months later, I moved to another city, leaving behind New York and all the painful memories. I started working at a startup where I felt I could find myself again. The past had left a deep mark, but I realized that now my path was one of recovery and new opportunities. The weeks following my move were filled with internal struggles. I was trying to recover from the betrayal that had destroyed not only my marriage but also my career. However, the painful memories did not let me go. I did not seek contact with Julia, and I ignored all her attempts to contact me. But life had another blow for me. One evening, I met Alex at the gym I started going after I moved. It was unexpected and, frankly, unwelcome. I saw him a few meters away near the dumbbells. He noticed me, but did not try to avoid me. On the contrary, his impudent smile rekindled the anger I thought had faded. I approached him, not hiding my mood. My heart was beating fast, but this time I was determined. Before he could say anything, I started, "Do you still think you got away with it?" Alex tried to joke. "Mark, seriously? That was a long time ago. Maybe we should put it behind us." His words only made me angrier. Everything that had happened replayed in my head. Julia, the corporate, her lies, my ruined marriage. I couldn't take it anymore. All rational thoughts disappeared, and I punched him in the jaw. Alex did not expect the blow, but quickly tried to fight back. We found ourselves in a fierce fight among the simulators. His blows were weak, but full of desperation. My anger made me stronger. One of the trainers at the gym rushed to pull us apart, but I managed to land a few more punches before we were separated. Alex was sitting on the floor, his lip was busted, and his eyes were full of fear. I could see that this time he felt the consequences of his actions. Everyone around us was looking at us, but I didn't care. My decision to break up with Julia was the right one, and this meeting only confirmed it. I left the gym without a word. I was bitter in my heart, but relieved at the same time. This fight didn't bring anything back, but it put an end to the story that had destroyed my life. Now I knew I could move on. The next morning, I received a message from Julia. She found out about the fight and wrote that she wanted to talk. I deleted her message without even opening it. That chapter of my life was closed forever. A few months later, I started a new job at a startup in Chicago. My life gradually stabilized, and I even started dating. The betrayal left a deep scar, but it also made me stronger. I no longer paid attention to the past and learned to live anew. This story has remained in my memory as a lesson about trust, honor, and the consequences of making the wrong choice. And although the pain of the betrayal still reminded me sometimes, I knew that I deserved a better future.